All right, hi. My name is Lieke Asma. I unfortunately couldn't be there at the workshop in February, but I have two talks for you, and this is the first one. I first want to tell you a little bit about my background to give an idea of what I'm interested in this talk. So I studied psychology first, and I noticed that a lot of the concepts we talk about in psychology, like free will or autonomy or self-determination, we spend less time in general as psychologists, or at least was my experience, on how we should actually define these concepts and what it exactly means and what's the background behind the concepts we use. And that's why I decided to study philosophy as well. And I really noticed that there's a very interesting difference between philosophy and psychology. It's a very general difference. It doesn't apply all the time. But in general, my experience is that philosophers are mostly concerned with what questions. So they are mostly concerned with asking what is free will, what is self-determination, what is autonomy. And psychologists, on the other hand, experimental psychologists, are mostly interested in why questions. So why are some people more autonomous than other people? What can autonomy explain about, for example, well-being or mental health or things like that? So because of that, psychologists tend to spend more time thinking about how to measure these concepts, and philosophers tend to spend more time about thinking about how to define these concepts and see how they relate to other concepts. And that's why I think that fundamentally philosophers and psychologists just need to cooperate. That's the only way to mutually strengthen each other's methods, so to say. And I think there's one particular challenge that I want to talk about, and that's very relevant for this course as well. And that is, how do we translate from a philosophical concept to a psychological measurement? So we can talk about free will, we can talk about self-determination, about autonomy. But if we want to answer why questions, so if we want to answer questions about does adversity increase personality growth, for example, does personality growth lead to better mental health, things like that, or how are these concepts exactly related, we need to translate it to a specific measurement instrument. We need to be able to measure it and to compare between different groups of people. And well, the main point of this talk is actually going to be that it's very hard. It's very difficult to translate philosophical concepts or theological concepts to concrete measurements. You will always have to make choices, accept certain limitations, reflect on what you can actually conclude from this translation to other daily life problems. And I think, that's just one of the main messages, that we just constantly have to keep reflecting on what we are doing, why we are doing it. And I understand this problem as the translation challenge. So I think this goes two ways, or both ways, so to say. So on the one hand, we need to translate these philosophical concepts like free will, self-determination, autonomy to concrete measurements. But then again, we also have to translate the things we have measured to what we care about in daily life. So, in a way you could say we go from very general to more specific and to actually asking questions to people to more general again and more, relevant for daily life. And we really have to think about how we should do these things. And this is really a question about validity. So validity means that we have to, it's one of the main challenges in experimental psychology, that we need to measure what we actually want to measure. So if you want to measure free will, you have to think about, okay, what is free will and how can I translate it to a concrete way of measuring it? And of course, we also want to do it reliably. So we don't want to have a measurement instrument that gives one score on day 1 and a very different score on day 4 for the same person without any manipulation, because we want it to be stable to some extent. But my talk is mainly going to be about validity. And I will give 2 examples. So one example is free will, which is really something I've been thinking about quite a lot. And the other example is autonomy, specifically in self-determination theory. And I will show that for both concepts, a lot of problems have emerged, or at least questions emerge from how to translate these things. And after that, I will say something about what we can learn from how we could measure personality growth and which questions we need to ask in order to do so reliably and validly, mainly. So free will. Well, this is quite... Most people know this example, but I'm not sure what your backgrounds are in this sense. So Benjamin Libet is a neuroscientist who studied or started studying free will in the 1980s. And he was mainly inspired by Kornhube and Deke, who found out that if you ask people to make a voluntary movement, so for example, move their wrist or push a button at a certain point, without any pre-planning or without any reason actually to do so, but I will get back to that later, that there is this buildup of brain activity. So there is, before people actually make this movement, so before they push the button or move their wrist, there's already a buildup of brain activity. And Libet was, well, you could say Libet was kind of worried what this would mean for free will, because if the conscious intention to move would only occur somewhere after this buildup of brain activity, he was worried that the conclusion would be that free will doesn't exist, because our conscious intentions and our conscious self only come to the stage after the brain activity has already built up and the brain has already made the decision, so to say. So what Libet did was ask participants to come to his lab and measure their brain activity, and at the same time ask them to push a button or move their wrist at the moment they felt the urge to do so, so spontaneously without any pre-planning. And these participants also had to watch a clock and see where the arrow on the clock was at the moment that they experienced a conscious intention to make the bodily movement. Well, in this way, Libet had all the information he needed to compare these different aspects of making a voluntary movement. And the reason we are still talking about Libet's experiment is that his results were quite shocking, or at least if you follow his line of reasoning, that the conscious intention has to be there before the buildup of brain activity, then his findings are quite shocking, because, as the findings show, there's a buildup of brain activity before the conscious intention. So it seems that the brain has already made a decision before we consciously start to think about whether we really want to make a certain movement or not. And this has led to a lot of discussion among neuroscientists who improved on this initial experiment and tried to make it more reliable and valid as well. But philosophers weren't convinced, and I think they have good reasons for it. There are several reasons for it, but I want to focus on one. Well, actually two related reasons. So one common criticism is that even though some philosophers think that free will requires the ability to do otherwise, so the ability to do something else than you actually did. So, for example, if I have a coffee, I can only do this freely if I could also have decided not to have a cup of coffee. But that doesn't mean that free will is the same as freedom from. It doesn't mean that you cannot be influenced by anything. It only means that if you had reason to, you could have not pushed the button or moved your wrist. And Libet hasn't shown that this is the case, so he hasn't shown that we don't have alternative possibilities. But what is perhaps more important is that free will is not the same as random picking. So free will is not about choosing one of 4 identical cups of coffee, for example. But it's about acting for reasons, and that's something that almost all philosophers agree on, that it has to do something with justification for your action, for being able to do something good, for being able to justify the decision you make. So that's free will proper. It's not about indifference or random picking. So to translate this to what I was talking about earlier, you could say that this study is not a valid measurement of free will. It does not measure the phenomenon we want to capture. So it doesn't measure whether people are able to act for reasons, whether they are able to do things in light of what they think a good thing to do is. And because of that, we could say Benjamin Libet's experiment doesn't say anything about free will and whether we have it and whether we are able to act for reasons. Well, and then psychologists thought challenge accepted. Well, that's not really true because this study is from the 70s, but at least this is how the reasoning goes in the literature on free will. All right, then we will focus on experiments in which we are talking about reasons and we are talking about actually making decisions. So then we come to an experiment by Wilson and Nisbet, so as I said from the 70s, and they asked housewives. So in the 70s you still had like genuine housewives who were in the mall, and they had this table with 4 identical pairs of stockings. And I use socks here in this example to make it more neutral and accessible to everyone. But the idea is that they these participants, of course, didn't know what the goal of the study was. So the only thing that they asked these participants was to choose the pair that had the best quality. So there were 4 pairs on the table, and then they just could try them, feel them, smell them, and then had to make a decision which one was the best. Well, and as it turns out, most participants, so most of these housewives, selected the rightmost pair. So they gave all kinds of reasons. So they said, well, the rightmost pair is most elastic, it smells the best, it seems to be the strongest pair. But in fact, in reality, it was their choice was caused by a psychological mechanism, you could say, because as research shows, often when we have to choose between identical things, we choose the rightmost option. And at the same time, these participants came up with all these kinds of reasons that are not really there. So for some psychologists and also philosophers, this is a reason to think, well, if free will really has to do with acting for reasons, then this experiment has shown that we don't act for reasons. Reasons are not things that cause our decisions. We give them after the fact, after we've already been influenced to make a certain choice. But then the philosopher asks, and also some psychologists and neuroscientists, of course, what are reasons for action? So what counts as a reason for an action and what counts as an ordinary cause? And this is something that these psychologists didn't reflect on a lot, because they just, actually didn't really make a distinction between all the different factors that could influence a decision. But as philosophers would emphasize, well, reasons for which we act, so actually things that justify our decisions, that speak in favor of an action, are not just causes. They are things that we also use in ordinary conversations to make clear to people why we do what we do. And I really like this way of some people putting it in response to this experiment. If you ask people for 4 identical, in a situation in which they have to choose between 4 identical things, and you ask them which one is the best one, they will give motivating reasons. So they will, as an answer, they will give the things we actually think about in normal daily life as reasons. They wouldn't say, well, I've been influenced by a psychological mechanism, because that doesn't justify their decision. So as some of these philosophers put it, these psychologists have completely lost track of our ordinary way of giving and asking for reasons, which is about justification and about things that speak in favor of a certain action. So again, we could criticize this experiment by saying, you are not really studying free will because you're not really studying reasons as we normally understand it, as things that support a certain action or things that justify a certain action. So again, we do not have a valid measurement of free will. And of course, you could, in a way, it feels a bit easy to just reject all these psychological experiments and to just say, well, you're not using the right concept in your studies. But I think this also shows how extremely difficult it is to measure something like free will and to make it, to translate this very general concept that we has a function in daily life and in how we interact with people to a very concrete experiment or to a very concrete measurement. And I think we should always be aware of it. Also, if we criticize these experiments, because, well, we just have to realize how complicated it is. And, well, every experiment is maybe a step in the right direction, or maybe not, but something to reflect on. So that's free will. And another thing I want to focus on is autonomy and self-determination theory. So the self-determination theory, I don't know whether you discussed it during the workshop as well, but it's a very popular and I think very useful theory about motivation and also about well-being. And the idea is that one of our psychological needs is autonomy. So it's very important for us for well-being and for our mental health to feel that we have made our own decisions and that we're not being influenced by or not just doing what other people think that we should be doing. And it's very interesting. So if you look at the definition of Ryan and Deasy on autonomy from this paper from 2004, they say to the degree that one's behavior is organized in accord with abiding values and interests, rather than being controlled or entrained by forces alien to them, it is experienced as autonomous. So what is really interesting about this definition is that on the one hand, they give a definition of what we think of is actual autonomy. So a lot of people think that autonomy is about acting in line with your values, doing what you endorse, identify with, things like that. But on the other hand, they also say that it should be experienced as autonomous. And what is interesting about this case is that we could come up with cases in which these things come apart. So one example is implicit bias. There's a well-known study. Well, there are a lot of studies on implicit bias, but one very interesting study, I think, is by Ullman and Cohen from 2005. And they set up a very interesting experiment, and also, I think, a very smart experiment, actually. So they divided their participants in two groups, and in one group, the participants received a CV from Michelle, who turned out to be more streetwise, and Michael, who was more formally educated. And the other group received CVs in which it was the other way around. So here Michael was more streetwise and Michelle had the right formal education. And the question to these participants was, well, which of these candidates would you select as the new police chief? And as it turns out, most candidates selected Michael for the job, regardless of his credentials. So if he was formally educated, he was often selected for the job. And if he was more streetwise, he was also often selected for the job. And well, it's important to mention that it's for like traditional feminine jobs, it's the other way around. So it's not just about selecting males, it's about having a job that is traditionally thought of as a typical male job, and then people use these credentials kind of to justify their initial decision to choose the male candidates. But the interesting thing about this case is that these participants thought of themselves as making a very objective choice. So these people thought, well, I'm a very egalitarian person, I don't choose on the basis of gender, I actually made this decision on the basis of this credential. I actually think that formal education or streetwiseness is more important for police chiefs. And well, this is kind of a counterexample, or at least a challenge to Ryan and Deasy's definition of autonomy, because these people have the experience that they make a decision that's very much in line with their values, not choosing on the basis of gender, making an egalitarian decision, but at the same time, they are not really acting in line with their values. So their experience of autonomy, their experience of making their own decisions, doing what they think is good, what they would endorse, is not the same as, the actual nature of the decision. So it's interesting that in this case, that you have to kind of make a decision. Are we interested in actual autonomy, or are we interested in the experience of autonomy? And what is interesting about Ryan and Deasy's theory, so then I get back to this point about why are we measuring this? How is it relevant for daily life? And yeah, how do we make these choices? And you could say that for Ryan and Deasy, it doesn't really matter that much whether people are actually autonomous, because what they are interested in is people's experience of autonomy. So they are interested in the question, how feeling that you're making your own decisions and not being influenced by, or just, other people making your decisions for you, how that is connected to well-being and to motivation. And in that sense, the experience of autonomy is precisely what they want to know. But again, we have to be really careful, because if we want to translate these findings, because that's also how they measure it, so the questionnaire is also about the experience of autonomy in general. And if we then would translate it to making claims about actual autonomy, we have to be careful, of course, because then we can say, well, people can experience autonomy, people can have the feeling that they choose in line with their values, but that's not the same as actually acting in line with your values. So here, a lot of questions emerge. We have to reflect on what we're doing and why we're doing it. And I think that's just the general point of this talk, that, we cannot just make a plan, use some questionnaires from the literature and draw conclusions. We constantly have to reflect on what we are doing, why we are doing it, how we've made these translations to questionnaires, and how we are going to translate them back to, for example, how we can make people increase well-being, for example, or make people more autonomous, or increase their personal growth. So we constantly have to be very critical about what we're doing and realize that there are limitations and, how we should deal with those in the best possible way. So that brings me to personality growth. So how then can we measure personality growth? So what I use the model from that's also posted on the website. And I want to focus specifically on virtuousness. So that's for me a very interesting question. So how can we measure how virtuous someone is? Of course, we talk about virtue. We say that someone is more virtuous than another person, or that someone is courageous or very honest. But how do we actually know? How do we measure something like that? And how do we compare between different people? Well, so then the first step would be to give a definition of virtues and to understand what they actually are. So, in virtue ethics and in general in philosophy, I think the basic idea is that virtues are excellent traits of character. So they are, very good ways of being, things that we admire in people. So, for example, open-mindedness, courage, or honesty, or something like that. And what is also crucial is that these traits are typically thought of as dispositions. So sometimes dispositions are also thought of as causes, so as things that can explain virtuous behavior and feelings and thoughts. But what we can actually measure, so what we can actually see and what we, on the basis of which we ascribe this disposition to a person, is a pattern. And that pattern is a pattern to feel, perceive, act, and decide in a certain way. For example, in an honest way or in a courageous way. So I think that's kind of what we more or less agree on, that there's this pattern, and that we have to, in order to know whether some person is more honest than another person, we have to try to capture this pattern and be able to measure it and compare it between groups. And I think one interesting challenge already is that, who gets to decide what the pattern courageous looks like? So I think often in these measurements, development of measurement questionnaires, for example, in which you ask, how often have you done certain things? Which feelings do you have? Which behaviors do you perform? Often what psychologists use to create these questions and to make decisions and to throw some questions out and leave others in, the starting point is just our basic intuitive understanding of what we think of as courageous. But there we can already ask some critical questions. So, for example, is it courageous to glue yourself to the streets, to make people aware of climate change, for example, or is that just being stupid or something else? So I think this is already something that we have to be critical about. What does this pattern look like, and who gets to decide what it looks like? And then, once we've decided on this, so I think in general, well, some people develop the questionnaires and other people use it to do other research. So we have to build on other people's work. So we cannot all start out from analyzing these patterns, but at least it's something to reflect on and to be critical about. But the next step, which is also, again, we use questionnaires other people have used, but still we do not use them blindly. We have to ask questions about it. And the second point is, well, how can we capture whether and to what extent a person displays this pattern? And this is also a very challenging question to ask. So as I said, there are different aspects to this pattern. So it's about feelings, it's about thoughts, it's about making certain decisions, it's about acting in a certain way. And how do we capture this? And well, as it's a nice way to put it, all these moralometers, so all these ways in which we can measure how moral or how virtuous someone is, they all have limitations. So first of all, the most obvious way to measure it, and which is most often used, is self-reports. And some critical questions we have to ask about self-report measures is the question whether our people are willing and able to report on their virtuousness. So there are some issues that we have to think about. So are people even able to do this? Because for one thing, virtue is not something that we can just observe. It really depends on the circumstances and how you interpret a certain action in certain circumstances. And of course, we tend to be more favorable towards our own actions compared to those of others. So, for example, we tend to attribute our bad behavior, or at least the behavior or decisions that we don't really think of as good. We tend to explain this in terms of external factors, and we give excuses for it. And then for other people, we tend to sometimes be more harsh maybe and say, well, they just have bad intentions or they don't have the relevant capacities. So it's important to think about this. How do we judge ourselves? And well, we are motivated to see ourselves favorably. And another interesting factor here is the moral Dunning-Kruger effect. So the Dunning-Kruger effect says that people who are more intelligent tend to realize, or who know more, tend to know that how much they know and also how much they don't know. So often the case is that people who have a lot of knowledge also know how difficult it is to get this knowledge and how many areas of science, for example, they know nothing about. And people who have less knowledge tend to also not know the amount of knowledge they don't have. So if you would ask someone, how much do you know, for example, about physics or about philosophy, then people who know less tend to say that they know quite a lot because they don't realize how much they don't know. And people who know a lot tend to realize, oh, I never thought about the problem of free will a lot, or I don't know a lot about epistemology or something like that. And they tend to say, well, I don't know a lot at all. And the same could happen when we talk about virtue. So people who have a better understanding of what it means to be courageous or what it means to be honest, they probably have an easier time recognizing where they fail to be honest or where they fail to be courageous, while people who lack understanding of these concepts tend to be more optimistic about their virtuousness. So that's also a factor to take into account. And then finally, social desirability is also an important factor because, of course, we want to be a virtuous person. So we want to give answers that support this view of ourselves. And another factor here is that if people have the suspicion that our goal is to measure the effect of adversity on personality growth, and they are in the category of people having adverse events, it's likely that they might answer the questionnaire in such an extent to support the findings of the researcher, because they like us, and then they feel like, well, we want them to find what supports their theory, so I'll just I had adversity, so I'll just say that I grew a lot from it. So these are all things to take into account. And now, of course, you may think, well, self-report is a terrible way of measuring morality or virtuousness. We have to use other methods. Well, okay, there are some other methods we could use. And some people have used these as well. So one way could be to ask other people. So we don't ask you how virtuous you are, but we ask your parents or your partner or people at work or something like that. But this is not the best strategy either, because there's an interesting tension here between how much people know of you and how biased they are. So if I have to answer questions about the virtuousness of my partner or my parents or my best friend, I tend also in this case to give a favorable answer, because I want my friends to be virtuous, or at least to some extent good people. And so I tend to give positive answers. And this happens the better I know a person. And if I would know a person less, so for example, a colleague that I don't see that often, then I don't really have this bias, because I can feel like, well, this is just a person that doesn't really have a lot to do with me. But I don't know this person very well either. So I don't have a lot of access to the behaviors and, well, especially not feelings, thoughts, and other internal processes. So asking others is also a very, slippery method in finding out how virtuous a person is. And another possibility would be observation. So there are some studies in which they try to find out how helpful people are. So there's this person who needs help, who is in a difficult situation, who's asking for help. And the question is, do people actually help them? And then also on the basis of these studies, sometimes pretty extreme conclusions are drawn, like people are not good people don't tend to help other people. But of course, this is only one behavior in a very specific setting that cannot just be translated to the person as a whole and to the person in general. So again, we have this very limited perspective, and the more we want something to be relevant for daily life, to say something about the person and how she is in the normal world, the less feasible it will be, because experiments always have to be like simple, controllable situations that we can easily measure. But then it's not really valid anymore. So there are a lot of difficulties here as well. And again, interpretation really depends on context. So it's also my perspective that I use to interpret certain behaviors. So even though self-measurement questionnaires have some difficulties and we have to take those into account, the other ways of measuring morality or virtuousness seem to be even more problematic, and seem to be, especially if we talk about virtue being a pattern, we want to capture the biggest part of the pattern as possible. We don't want to measure only the person as they are at work, or as they are with their partner, for example. So, in other words, one important insight is that in the end, the person itself has the best access to her pattern. So even though it has a lot of limitations, it's still one of the best methods to measure virtuousness would still be to ask the person herself, because this is the only person who sees herself in a lot of different contexts, who has access to her feelings and her thoughts, and is able to report on it. So one of the major challenges in psychology and also in this project will be to avoid the pitfalls. So to make sure that people don't answer in a way that's favorable for the experiment or that's favorable to themselves. So one important factor, of course, is anonymity, that they don't, it doesn't reflect on them how they answer the questionnaire. And so that they don't have any reason to present themselves better. And again, I think one of the important things that we have to keep reflecting on is, why do we want to know? So thinking back of Ryan and Deasy's definition of autonomy, do we want to know whether people experience personality growth, or do we want to know whether they are actually grown? And what exactly is the difference? And how do we compare between the two? And how do we decide what we actually want to know. So this part is really, again, about translating the findings back to real life and to, for example, questions about how are we going to facilitate growth and how are we, going to facilitate autonomy or self-determination. Then maybe the experience of personality growth might also be equally or even more important than actual personality growth. So again, these are things that we constantly have to reflect on in order to contribute with psychology to philosophical and theological questions we have.
Thank you, Lieke, for being here with us tonight. And everybody, just enjoy the interesting talk that you record for us. So let's start the discussion. You can raise hand or speak if we don't have a lot of requests.
So I was wondering about the philosophical response to psychological evaluations, like, for instance, the Nisbet and Wilson experiment. You said something like a philosophical response could be, well, this is not really talking about reasons for action or anything like that. What philosophers mean by reasons for action is very different from the actual motivations that psychology might discover underneath. But I take it, I didn't quite understand that response, because typically reasons for action are also taken to be causes, right? Reasons are a certain kind of causes. We have the whole Davidson debates, all that. So one of the insights that all people always thought is whatever reasons for actions are, they are also the type of stuff that causes actions. But now when psychologists discover that these are not really the causes for action, but that the causes for action in a statistically significant way are very different, then we lose the sense in which reasons are genuine reasons, in which reasons are actually causing action. So I guess I didn't understand your response to that sort of empirical challenge to the classical action model.
Thank you. That's a very interesting point. So I don't know whether you know Maria Alvarez's work on reasons. So she, and others as well, mainly state like the reasons for action. So the reasons for which a person actually acts are more than just causes. So they also have to justify our action. So they also have to speak in favor of an action. And I think these kinds of studies challenge us to critically reflect on this distinction, right? Or at least to make clear like what's special about reasons for action. And I think it's this dimension, right? That reasons we give for the actions we perform also have to justify it. And I think so the main response, I think in general, philosophers are more, or at least following this kind of reasoning and also following Davidson, right? Because Davidson also says a reason for action is something that speaks in favor of the action. It's not just a cause, it should also, it should explain and justify it. And I think experiments like this really challenge us to think about like how, also about validity again. So how can psychological research be inform us about our practice of giving and asking for reasons as well? And I think the critical philosophical response to these kinds of studies is that on the one hand, we have this practice, and that's kind of what philosophers are trying to understand. How do we give and ask for reasons? How do we make distinctions between actual reasons and mere causes? And that this distinction is not implemented in the psychological research. So of course you could say some things are not done for reasons at all. And then some people would say, for example, Davidson, that they are no longer actions. And so if we would only find like psychological mechanistic explanations, like order effects or something like that, and there would not be any justification or anything speaking in favor of it, then it would no longer count as an action. So that's kind of the philosophical perspective. And well, actually, my personal view would be that that reasons for actions are actions at a higher level of description. So I would say they are not event causal causes like psychological mechanisms or psychological explanations would be. So I think there would be a larger difference between the two. Is that an answer to your question?
Sure. I mean, I could have a follow-up, but maybe I should let somebody else first. I mean, part of the challenge remains, even if you have this view, which is surely a good view to have, that reasons are not only causal explanations, but also justificatory explanations, all that. But still, I mean, if we cite reasons for an action, we sort of what that concept carries with us is also that this genuinely delivers us at least partially a causal explanation for the action. And if it turns out, we figure out that this is really not the case, but it's only given ex post, that this really, this is really challenging. Because at the same time, these sorts of choices, prima facie, we would still count them as action, as genuine actions. So that seems to be still a serious problem for that model. I mean, just to steelman the psychologists a bit here, right? I mean, even if you have that view, that it is also justificatory, but you also want to have it causally efficacious. And if that is undermined, you have at least some sort of undermining.
Yeah, so actually I should have made another point as well. So the main point I also wanted to make in relation to this study is that if you think of reasons as justifying what you do, so if you think of reasons as not just causal explanations, then you should, and you want to test how this exactly works and how it competes with psychological explanations and stuff like that, you should do an experiment in which there are actually reasons speaking in favor for one choice instead of the other. And so that's also my point here, that they, like the Libet study, they present people with a situation in which there is nothing that really justifies one choice over the other. There is only psychological explanation. So I think if you want to really investigate what it means to act for reasons and whether, well, of course we confabulate, definitely. I'm not going to deny that at all. But if you really want to investigate how often we confabulate and how it's connected to actually justifying reasons, you should put people in a situation where there is a justification. Because now the only option they have, given the fact that we in our normal practices use reasons to justify actions, or when we ask for reasons, we ask for justifications and not causal explanations, merely causal explanations, then you should not ask people to justify their choice if there is no justification. So they have to confabulate in a way. So that's also the point I wanted to make. Yeah, so in that sense, I don't think that these findings can be generalized to all our actions. But of course, I mean, there are some more interesting studies about confabulation, I think. And well, I think it's obvious in real life that we do something like that as well. So
yeah, we have Aku, then Benedict, then Catherine, and Godehard.
So a short comment on the previous discussion. There have been interesting studies on the neuroscience of kind of morally relevant and reason kind of value-laden choices, like Uri Maas and some of these others conducted experiments of kind of Libet-style experiments, but they looked at how people distribute money, might distribute money to different kinds of aid organizations. And it turned out in some of these studies that the readiness potential didn't even pop up. So it might be the case that the readiness potential that Libet and others are tracking is a mechanism to just to make it possible for people to make these kinds of random pickings or things like that. But that's a long story and goes into a different direction. So because there's much to discuss about this, I want to put it aside because it's not relevant to the topic that we're supposed to be discussing for the most part. I could spend the whole day discussing the free will stuff because that's what I do. But then let's put that aside. So my actual question. So your talk was, I enjoyed it very much, by the way, but the conclusion was that this process of operationalization and measurement is difficult. Okay, well that's the main point. I wanted to invite you to say a little bit more about how this difficulty might be surpassed. So any useful techniques or ways of thinking about this process of operationalization, because I've been doing the same thing with the psychologist colleagues of mine, and there seems to be no kind of rhyme or reason to it. You just sit down and try to figure out, I don't know how to measure things, so I have these ideas. I try to explain them to the psychologist. The psychologist is going to say, well, I have a measurement for that. Perhaps that might work. And then it's a kind of skill that you discuss and you try to figure out how to put together an abstract notion. And the psychologist is going to say, well, I've got these and these measurements, and perhaps we can get something together. But I was wondering whether you would have any kind of ways of doing that. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so I put most faith in using like multiple methods. I think that's one obvious solution, which is at least helping to some extent. So, for example, if you want to measure personality growth, I think it would also be interesting to also ask, for example, people that know the person really well and also observe behavior and use these different measurements. But then still, I think there is a sense in which there is so much going on behind developing these questionnaires. So there's like philosophical perspective about what it means to grow. So, for example, I don't know exactly who it was, but one of these researchers said, well, if people are more introverted, that's a sign of personality growth. And then, I really wonder, like, what's the reasoning behind this? How do we come up with this definition? So I think in that sense, there should be more cooperation between philosophers, theologians, and psychologists as well. And we should be more open about the fact that there's a lot of thinking going on behind it. But a more concrete suggestion would be, I think, to use multiple methods and compare them, and also acknowledge that we need to continue asking critical questions about what we're doing. But that's kind of all I can think of now.
Yeah. Benedict?
Yeah, well, thanks for a very interesting talk. I already learned a lot. I mean, probably my question is kind of a follow-up to Aku's question. I mean, are there concepts in psychology about which psychologists agree that you cannot measure them? So, or what are the necessary and sufficient conditions a concept has to satisfy, such that psychologists say, well, we can operationalize this concept? I mean, for instance, concerning free will, I mean, one could maybe argue, maybe in a Kantian style, that, well, this is just nothing to measure empirically. So is there some kind of meta-theoretical discourse in psychology? Are there concepts where people would say, well, we cannot measure these concepts? Thanks.
Yeah, good question. So I'm very familiar with the free will discussion, free will and science discussion, and there are people mainly writing critical papers as well. So mainly arguing, well, that it's just there are a lot of open, hard problems that we cannot just answer by conducting experiments. But I think in general, the idea is at least to get as close to measuring a certain construct as possible, because there's not really an alternative either from the psychological and neuroscientific perspective. So if you read like psychological papers, especially on very abstract concepts like personality growth, then there's always a limitation section, and there's always a discussion about, generalizability, for example. So external validity, can we generalize to other groups, but also, questions about what we are exactly measuring. But in my experience, it's more rare. So it's often more about external validity and about problems with the experiment, but the measurement instrument, I think it would be good if we had more discussion about that as well, about what's going on behind these, because there's a tendency to just trust the numbers. As soon as we can have scores, then there must be some like substantial truth to it. But yeah, so that's kind of the message as well, I think. But yeah, in general, but it's if there's no alternative, we just try to get as close to measuring something as possible.
Yeah. Catherine? Thank you, Lieke.
Okay, just trying to figure out which of the various questions I want to ask first and how to put them. So first of all, I really did enjoy the talk. Thank you very much. Sorry. I appreciate the kind of combining of the philosophical and psychological viewpoints, which I found lacking in a lot of psychology I've been reading. So this really like fills in some gaps for me and says that actually, no, these questions are good questions to be asking. And there's a reason I don't understand a lot. So thank you. So one question I had is about measuring, okay, maybe I'll use your example of courageousness to illustrate the question. And the question has to do with the, as you even said, the importance of the context in which a particular disposition or trait is manifested. So you said, something like courageousness is a disposition, and a disposition is something that manifests in particular contexts and not in others. And that means that a disposition has manifestation conditions, features of the context that make it more likely that a person is going to exhibit courageousness or whatever the disposition is. So apart from the question of what is courageousness, which is one aspect of the question, it seems to me that another thing that you would have to measure isn't just what a person does, but what the conditions are in which this disposition is going to be manifested. And that, I think, wouldn't that take into account a lot of kind of contextual variables that aren't even apparent to the person themselves or to the other people who are evaluating the person? So kind of, I guess, so how is there a way in which it's, these kinds of manifestation conditions that are aspects of the context are measured? And I know that the kind of, trait psychology that you're drawing on is a bit controversial, because I know that a lot of people think that there aren't even really stable traits to begin with because of these contextual considerations. But I guess just this first question is, how do, taking into account context, how is that aspect of these things, how can that be measured?
Yeah, so those questionnaires, I contributed to developing a questionnaire about attitudes towards science. So that's a very different topic, but I know like the general steps people take to develop these questionnaires. And I think in general, most of these questionnaires, also if you look into personality psychology and or the Big Five, for example, the questions include contextual features. So often people are asked if blah, 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 then I would run into the burning building, or I would jump into the water, or what. So the questions often integrate these contextual features, but of course it's also quite like, I've never actually been in a situation where I have to jump in the water or might run into a burning building. So yeah, it's kind of So that, I mean, one solution to this would be to put people in an experimental situation and see how they actually respond, of course. But yeah, so this is a very valid concern about psychological research, that often, well, people are asked for their own their own expectations about themselves, but also this gap between asking people about their intentions or their expectations about themselves, while if we talk about the trait, we really care about behavior as well. So we really want to know what people actually do in different situations, not what they think they would do or what they expect what they would do. So I guess that speaks in favor of using some experimental measures as well. But then, I mean, one of the criticisms of this, like the Doris kind of, I think you're talking about Doris' point as well, right? John Doris, that he's saying, well, virtues don't exist because it's just the context that determines what we do. So then the criticism of these views is that, well, we cannot generalize it to other situations as well. So yeah, there's just, yeah, there are a lot of difficulties there. And I think, again, it's good to be aware of, well, limitations of these approaches. But I think one solution would at least be to include some behavioral aspects and, yeah, see how people actually respond. And it can also be like more simple situations in which, well, people have to perform simpler actions. But yeah, there's always this challenge of trying to translate actual behavior to experiments as well, and then seeing whether it can be generalized. So yeah, that's definitely a challenge.
Thank you. Can I ask another question that draws on what other people were already asking?
Yeah,
Yes.
I think
There's so many in line. I don't know.
Is that
yeah,
okay?
we are already over time, but I
Oh.
think everybody's like enjoying, and I don't know, maybe we can use 5 more minutes. Is that okay for everybody?
Well, I hope it's kind of well, anyway, I'll just get it out. If it does turn out that there's a concept that you know, you look at the measures in psychology and then you look at what philosophers have said and you just think that the measures that there are in psychology just, you know, I suppose there's even a huge literature, just are not really adequate to capture the thing that you think is really important as a philosopher. Like, what do you do? Do you, like, if you want to make a contribution to psychology, what do you do? Do you say, can you write an opinion piece in a psychological journal and say, like, hey guys, here's why I think all of these measurements are inadequate to capture a really important concept? Or would psychologists kind of laugh at you and reject the paper?
Well, so I published I mainly publish in interdisciplinary journals like theory and psychology or philosophical psychology. But to be honest, I don't know to what extent psychologists actually read what I'm saying. So maybe not. But yeah, so I'm kind of, because in a way it's also very easy. I feel like it's too easy to just criticize these measurements, because there's always something to criticize, and psychologists know this. So it's kind of, yeah, I think, well, one of the challenges would be to be constructive and to reflect on how it can be improved. Because I mean, we could, of course, be this critical and say, well, we shouldn't do psychological research at all or something like that. But of course, this is the only to standardize measurements and compare and look at causal relationships and things like that. So psychology also has a lot of advantages that philosophy doesn't have. But yeah, so I think the challenge should be together to get us close to measuring what we want to know, and yeah, contribute as philosophers, contribute to reaching this goal as well.
Thanks.
Godehard?
Yeah, maybe we can take Ryan also then and finish. Then everybody had an opportunity to speak who raised their hands. So first of all, Lieke, thank you very much for your talk. And it seems to me the decision to pre-record these talks in terms of the technical quality of the slides and so really paid off. And you can always look at them afterwards and we can use them for the next class next year. So thanks for doing this. My question is pretty much similar to Aku's, and I want to specify it a little bit. It seems at the end of your talk that what we are trying to do is almost bound to fail, and it sounded a bit discouraging in a way. So let's say we have a group in one of our groups wants to study, hope I get this right, that if someone believes in God or has a certain faith in God and is going through an adverse experience like a loss of a person or end of a partnership, is that person, and we assume that it's a sign of personality growth to integrate a negative experience. Are those people more likely to integrate, or are they more able to integrate the negative experience? Prima facie, would you think something like this is operationalizable and is measurable, or are we trying to achieve too much here? That personality growth is too vague a concept.
Yeah, so definitely, I think this can be measured to some extent, because first of all, you made a very concrete point about integrating negative experiences. So that's already a very much more concrete aspect of personality growth. So we can really think about, okay, how can we measure something like that? So that's already much less vague than something like personality growth in general. So you're already taking a step towards operationalizing the construct. And I also think that one very important point, so I tried to say some things about how to remedy these difficulties. So I think one very important point is that people don't know what we're measuring. So we shouldn't ask them, do you believe in God? Did you have bad experiences? And then let them do this questionnaire, because then it's so obvious that to them what we want to measure, and they of course they want to give an answer that satisfies our research goals or something like that. So I think one of the main things we can do, or our psychologists can do, or when you do psychological research, is to make sure that your participants don't really know what your aim with the study is. So you have to so sometimes they have to fill out like a informed consent or something like that, but you should not be too explicit about what you want to measure. And I think that's one way to, well, and anonymize, of course, but there are other reasons to do that as well. But I think this is a very important step in making sure that people don't give answers that they think support our research goal. So I think that would be two things, like making it as concrete as possible, what we want to know, like, well, integrating negative experiences, reflecting on, okay, how can we measure this? And then, well, really think about in which order we are going to ask the participants these different aspects, and how we are going to make sure that they don't know what our goal is. And I think that's those are two important steps towards measuring as valid and reliable as possible.
Thank you.
Should I go ahead and ask a last question? My question is also in the same kind of vein as Aku's question and Godehard's question, about how to overcome some of the difficulties of measurement. It's just specifically about two of the difficulties that you mentioned. So one having to do with socially desirable responding, and the other having to do with the possibility of a kind of Dunning-Kruger effect. I'm vaguely aware that there's a kind of index of socially desirable responding that some researchers will use, and I guess the aim of that is to sort of try to measure a person's tendency to desire in a socially respond in a socially desirable way, and then to kind of control for that as you're developing a measure. I haven't used that. I'm curious about if you have any comments about its usefulness, or is that a good way to go to include that when you're developing a measure? And then my second question is there anything comparable for trying to control for Dunning-Kruger-like effects?
Yeah, so this is going to be a disappointing response. So I'm not, actually, it's quite interesting because I know that these questionnaires exist, but I've never come across a study using it. So sometimes people integrate it in their questionnaire, so they have some control questions in the questionnaire. So that might be something to look into, definitely, whether that's a possibility, because that's also a way to like obscure the fact that we are trying to find out whether they give socially desirable answers. And the Dunning-Kruger effect, yeah, that's a very good question, how we could compensate for something like that. So maybe one, I mean, so for example, using courage, and like if the researcher has a clear idea of what courage is, and well, uses philosophical insights on courage, for example, then of course you could make the questions, the items that people respond to, more concrete. So in more concrete situations. But yeah, I think that's a difficult problem, definitely. But if you would make it more concrete, maybe that's somewhat helpful, because then because then we kind of already decide for them what courage looks like, even if they don't really understand the concept, or even if they so that's one solution, I think. But yeah, it's definitely a challenge to think about this, especially in the context of virtue and measuring virtue.
Yeah, I would like to add
Thanks.
something. Yeah, sorry.
I was just saying thank you.
Yeah, I would like to add something to the discussion. And today, I think all the questions were around the same thing that Aku was pointed out at the beginning. And I wonder, in Asma, Lieke, if being more concrete can actually be helpful for these situations. Because if we are being very ambitious and we want to assess complex constructs, let's say humility, let's say spirituality, virtuousness, then we are not being specific enough in order to make science. We have to be specific regarding the phenomena we are trying to measure, right? And I think this is a good way to circumvent these kind of issues. And I would like to give you an example of this. There is a paper, it was published last month in Consciousness and Cognition, and they wanted to evaluate the reactions to future neurotechnologies. And technically the procedure was, they told participants that they have a brain scanner that could read attitudes, right? And then they just gave false attitude feedback just randomly. And most people, the finding is that most people agree with the feedback and justify the feedback. So they are reporting the following findings. Random feedback from AI scanner caused a congruent change in reported attitudes. And I think this is the key. They are being specific. Change in reported attitudes, instead of being non-specific and say attitude influence. Because if we say we are influence attitudes, then you don't know if the attitude actually change or not, or how the influence procedure happens, the components. But they are being specific, they are being smart. Just changing reported attitudes, the kinds we have self-reported. So I think these kind of things we can take care of empirical research if we are careful and specific. I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. So it's very clear what these people have measured and what the limitation of the findings are. But so actually, I thought you were going in a different direction, because it's also what's it called? It's one of those fallacies that if a description is general enough that it applies to everyone. So if you say something like, "Oh, you're Aquarius," or "You're sometimes insecure and sometimes you're angry about something," then everybody recognizes this. So this is also a famous psychological study. So I was also thinking, well, one remedy would also be to make sure, and I think that most psychologists do this in their studies as well, to not ask people, how courageous are you, or do you have courageous thoughts, but if you would be in this situation. So it has downsides because you don't measure the actual behavior, but it's in these items you already put your definition of courage as well, right? So if you make them more concrete and more concrete situations, it's there's less room for different interpretations and for mistaking what courage actually is, or something like that. So I think that's one way how psychologists actually make these questionnaires, which is to make sure that people cannot be mistaken about what is asked, and cannot use too many different interpretations. So that's also a sense in which more concrete things would remedy the Dunning-Kruger effect as well, I think, to some extent. But yeah, good points as well.